Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable: sleep. Or, more accurately, how medieval people slept, which turns out to be far weirder than most of us could imagine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before electricity, TikTok, and sleep hygiene influencers, medieval people approached nighttime with a schedule that would baffle the modern melatonin enthusiast. It was called segmented sleep, a natural two-part sleep cycle, split neatly in half like a stale medieval biscuit. The routine was simple. After sundown, most people turned in early, drifting off into what was known as first sleep. Then, after about 4 hours, they'd wake up, deliberately, and spend the next hour or two doing what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This wasn't considered insomnia. It was just how sleep worked. The watch period between the two sleeps was seen as practical, useful, and occasionally, alarmingly social. People used this time to pray, read religious texts, tend fires, or check their livestock, because nothing ruins your REM cycle, like wondering if your goat is still in the yard. And yes, this was also considered the ideal time for intimacy. Medieval physicians and marriage manuals noted that the body was well rested and calm of mind during this period, which sounds like a polite way of saying too tired to argue. So if you ever thought you were romantic for waking up early to make your partner coffee, just know your ancestors were setting the bar very differently. The second sleep would follow this interlude, lasting until sunrise. Everyone from monks to farmers participated in this nightly rhythm. Even literary figures like Chaucer casually mentioned it, which means that, yes, even in medieval literature, people were writing about not sleeping properly. Oddly enough, modern science has suggested that segmented sleep might actually be more natural for humans. The two-sleep cycle aligns with how our circadian rhythms work in the absence of artificial light. So the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m, don't panic. Just whisper, "Ah yes, the watch has begun," and go tend a symbolic fireplace. It wasn't until the industrial era, with factories, gas lamps, and the growing fear of unproductivity, that humans began to enforce the idea of 8 uninterrupted hours, as though sleep were a timed sport. In the medieval world, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't failure. It was the schedule, and everyone was on it, whether they liked it or not. Let's talk about beds, or rather, the medieval approximation of them. In today's world, we obsess over thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and whether a mattress is cloud-like. In medieval Europe, a bed was often just a pile of stuff that used to be alive, now flattened under the weight of poor sleep and unspoken regrets. The typical peasant bed consisted of a straw mattress, known as a pallet. This was literally straw or hay stuffed into a sack of rough fabric, if they had the luxury of a sack. If not, it was just straw on the floor, possibly damp, possibly already claimed by a cat. These pallets were not comfortable, but they were better than nothing, which was the alternative. Straw was cheap, plentiful, and good at insulating against the cold. It was also great at harbouring insects, lice, and the occasional field mouse, which made sleeping an exercise in cautious stillness. If it itched, you ignored it. If it bit, you just shifted slightly and hoped for the best. If a family had a bit more money, or at least a functional back, they might elevate the straw mattress onto a wooden frame. This didn't change the sleep experience dramatically, but it did reduce the chances of waking up with beetles in your ear. Slightly. Linens were a rare treat. Most people slept in the clothes they wore all day. Pyjamas weren't really a thing, and neither was personal space. Whole families, children, parents, maybe a grandparent, all slept together in the same space, sometimes on the same straw pile. If you got too warm, you could always roll into your cousin's elbow. Nobles, of course, had proper beds. Large wooden frames, feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, and canopies to keep out the drafts and, hopefully, the lice. These beds were so valuable, they were passed down in wills. You didn't inherit land. You inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. Still, for most medieval folks, a bed wasn't a place of comfort. It was a place to not freeze, to avoid the chickens, and maybe, just maybe, to dream of being rich enough to one day sleep on something that didn't squawk or rustle. When we hear nightcap today, we think of a cosy little drink, maybe something with whiskey, a warm fire, and a questionable decision. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a beverage, it was a hat. A real, tangible, often ridiculous-looking piece of fabric designed to keep your head from freezing off while you slept. You see, insulation wasn't exactly the strong point of medieval architecture. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made of thin animal horn or oiled parchment didn't do much against the cold. And central heating? That was called a dog. So to keep their heads warm at night, especially since body heat escapes fastest through the scalp, medieval people adopted the humble nightcap. These hats came in all shapes and sizes, but the most iconic version was long and pointed, like something you'd expect on a wizard who moonlights as a chimney sweep. They were usually made from wool, linen, or whatever scrap of warmth could be spared without angering the family goat. For men, it was a practical accessory. For women, it sometimes doubled as a coif or head wrap, which also served the dual purpose of maintaining modesty and covering hair that hadn't seen soap since last Lent. But beyond warmth, nightcaps had social weight too. In some regions, married women were expected to cover their heads at all times, yes, even while asleep, and the cap itself could be embroidered or dyed to reflect a family's wealth or status. Because nothing says success like going to bed with a mini flag on your skull. In more urban settings, the nightcap even became a symbol of being off-duty. If you opened your door wearing one, it was a polite medieval way of saying, "I'm not dressed for conversation, and yes, this hat does mean go away." Of course, nightcaps were often paired with nightshirts, which were essentially long, loose tunics. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge, minus the haunted moral lesson. Sleepwear wasn't sexy, but it was practical, itchy, and occasionally flammable. Today, the idea of sleeping next to a stranger is generally limited to red-eye flights, overly ambitious camping trips, or the occasional bizarre Airbnb mix-up. But in medieval Europe, this was completely normal, and not at all optional. Let's say you're a travelling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. You find an inn, a rare luxury in itself, and ask for a place to sleep. What you get is not a room, or a bed, or even a particularly clean floor. What you get is a spot, in a bed, that's already occupied. Medieval inns operated more like human bunkhouses than modern hotels. Privacy was not expected. If the bed had space, you were sharing it, usually with complete strangers who might snore, talk in their sleep, or have a suspicious number of boils. This was not considered rude. It was just efficient use of resources. Beds could host 2, 3, even 4 travellers, depending on size and social tolerance. In larger cities, you might end up in a dormitory-like hall with rows of beds and absolutely zero personal space. Snoring contests were unjudged. Elbow territory was fiercely contested. Sometimes men and women were separated, but not always. Some inns tried to assign beds by profession. Blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, thieves with other thieves, allegedly. But often it was first come, first sprawled. And while this might sound like a nightmare to modern germaphobes, back then it was an upgrade from sleeping outdoors with the wolves, the rain, and the occasional peasant uprising. Worried about theft? Many travellers slept with their purse tied to their belt or hidden under their clothes. Others slept on top of their bundles, turning luggage into both pillow and alarm system. If someone moved your bag, it usually meant you were about to wake up poorer. The rich, of course, did not suffer this fate. Nobles travelled with entourages and camped in relative comfort. or demanded their own rooms if an innkeeper valued their roof. In the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It was a spiritual operation, a nightly gamble where the stakes were your eternal soul. People didn't just sleep, they prepared to potentially die. Hence the popularity of bedtime prayers. Forget lavender spray or calming podcasts. Medieval sleepers wound down with confessions, psalms, and soul-cleansing spiritual clauses, just in case they died somewhere between good night and dawn. The idea was simple. You could die at any moment, from illness, fire, demons, or, most dangerously, being over 30 in the year 1247. So you'd better say your prayers, not because it was comforting, but because hell was terrifying, and you didn't want to show up uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually dishevelled. One common version? If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Sweet, right? Except it's basically a legal document written by a 7-year-old, acknowledging death as a likely bedtime outcome. Many adults had a whole catalogue of prayers for different threats. One for when you were feeling guilty. One for when you thought the devil might be hiding in the rafters. One for plague prevention, which unfortunately aged poorly. Some even prayed to specific saints known for watching over sleepers, kind of like holy bouncers guarding your soul at the club door. The really devout, monks, nuns, and overly anxious nobles ended their day with Compline, the final prayer service before bed. After Compline, they took a vow of silence, which wasn't hard because everyone was already exhausted, underfed, and mildly afraid of the dark. Children were also encouraged to pray, in part because it was good for their souls, and in part because it gave them something to do other than ask why the dog was in their bed again. Parents reminded them that angels were watching, which sounds adorable until you realize it was less guardian angel and more celestial surveillance system. In short, prayer before sleep was less about peace and more about last-minute damage control. Think of it like medieval antivirus software. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't fully understand how. In the modern world, dreams are usually dismissed as random nonsense, stress, too much cheese, or your brain trying to file paperwork in the dark. But in the medieval world, dreams were taken very seriously, as in eternal consequences serious. Dreams weren't just dreams, they were considered messages. From God, saints, the devil, your guardian angel, or possibly that weird relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were divine revelations, others were demonic temptations. Either way, you were supposed to pay attention and possibly write it down, or confess it, or fast for 3 days just to be safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent an alarming amount of time interpreting dreams. Entire texts were dedicated to decoding them. Dreamt of fire? Might be hell. Dreamt of water? Could mean purification, or drowning. Dreamt of a man with a goat's head juggling fish? You better call a priest immediately, and possibly move. Medieval people believed that what happened in dreams mattered, because your soul was still active while you slept. This meant that your actions in a dream could reveal hidden sins or spiritual weaknesses. That mildly embarrassing dream about stealing a loaf of bread, that might be your subconscious confessing your guilt for real-world gluttony, or just hunger. But still, better to confess it anyway, just in case. Monks and nuns often recorded their dreams and shared them with spiritual superiors. Some were celebrated for having holy visions during sleep. Others were quietly told to eat fewer onions before bed. Of course, dreams weren't just spiritual puzzles. They also made excellent plot devices. Medieval literature is full of dream sequences where knights encounter angels, demons, or metaphorical creatures spouting poetry about virtue. Dreams were basically the Netflix of the medieval world, except with more allegory and fewer happy endings. The church, predictably, was suspicious. Not all dreams were divine, and some were believed to be planted by demons to corrupt the innocent. If you dreamt of something unwholesome, It could mean your soul was under attack, or that you just slept too close to the fireplace fumes again. In modern times, some people let their pets sleep in the bed. It's a cozy, if occasionally smelly, arrangement. In the Middle Ages, however, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a quirky personal choice. It was a heating strategy. Let's start with the basics. Medieval homes weren't exactly built for comfort. Stone walls, no insulation, drafts so aggressive they probably had names. Central heating, that was called the family pig. In peasant homes, it wasn't unusual for humans and livestock to sleep in the same room, sometimes the same bed, and very often the same pile of straw. Chickens wandered freely, dogs curled up at your feet, pigs snorted softly beside the hearth. And if you were lucky, none of them bit you during the night. This wasn't about affection, though medieval people certainly appreciated their animals. It was about survival. Animals generated body heat. They were warm, dependable, and, unlike some relatives, didn't hog the blanket. A large dog could keep your toes from freezing. A cow in the corner might raise the room temperature by a degree or two, which in January felt like a miracle. Medieval homes, especially those of the lower classes, often had just one room for everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, occasionally dying. Everyone, humans and animals alike, made do with the same space. Children might be nestled between parents and a goat. A chicken might serve as an impromptu alarm clock. Hygiene? Let's not ask too many questions. For wealthier families, this wasn't as common. Nobles didn't usually sleep next to livestock, though they might still have lapdogs in bed. Not for heat, but for fashion and flea redistribution. Some castles even had separate sleeping areas for favourite animals, because nothing says power like a dog with its own room and title. There were drawbacks, of course. Animals can be loud. They can wander. And they are not, historically speaking, known for respecting personal space. But medieval people adapted. A hoof in the face at 3 a.m? Just part of the bedtime routine. If you've ever had to share a room at a youth hostel and thought, this is a bit much, allow us to introduce the medieval monastic dormitory, a place where comfort went to die quietly under a vow of silence. Monasteries didn't believe in personal space, or softness, or fun, really. The typical dormitory housed dozens of monks, all sleeping in a single large room, usually arranged in neat rows like morally upright sardines. Beds, if you could call them that, were often wooden planks, sometimes with a straw mattress if the abbot was feeling generous, or it was a feast day. You slept fully clothed. Not out of modesty, but because getting dressed in the dark at 2 a.m. for prayers was more painful than just going to bed already prepared. The monastic uniform, including robe, belt and sandals, doubled as spiritual armour and poor insulation. If you got cold, you layered up. If you got hot, well, no, you didn't. There were no pillows, no privacy curtains, and absolutely no talking. Silence was enforced, not suggested, under the rule of St. Benedict. If you rolled over and groaned too loudly, you might find yourself on chamber pot duty for a week. Snoring, however, was a grey area. You couldn't control it, but if it became disruptive, the Lord might still hold you accountable. Or at least your cellmates would. Lighting was minimal. 1 candle, maybe. You didn't need to see. You just needed to lie still and not sin. That was the goal. Despite the austerity, monks believed their Spartan beds were training for the afterlife, preparation for the soul's journey by denying the flesh any excess. Sleep was not a pleasure. It was a necessity, monitored and scheduled like everything else. Some monks even slept sitting up, just to avoid any hint of luxury, or dreams, or circulation. Compared to this, peasant straw piles and snoring pigs almost seem luxurious. At least the pig didn't judge you. Let's talk about something that would horrify most modern sleepers. Waking up voluntarily at 2 a.m, and not for a bathroom break or a doom scroll, but for prayer. Loud, cold, candle-lit prayer. In medieval monasteries, this was standard practice. Monks and nuns followed a rigid daily schedule based on the canonical hours, which included matins, the first service of the day. And by day, we mean the darkest part of the night, when even the owls were still deciding whether to wake up. The bell would toll, often rung by someone who drew the short straw, and the entire dormitory of robed, sleep-deprived souls would shuffle off to the chapel in silence. And yes, still in full clothing, because monks didn't do pyjamas. The only layering system they believed in was spiritual. Inside the chapel, by flickering candlelight and under the echo of stone vaults, they would chant psalms, recite scriptures, and try their best not to fall asleep on their feet. Which, incidentally, was a real issue. There are records of monks being punished for dozing mid-prayer, usually with extra chores or more prayers. You fell asleep in matins? Congratulations, you now get to lead the next one. Matins could last an hour or more. Some particularly enthusiastic orders stretched it to 2. Imagine trying to stay spiritually engaged while your stomach reminds you that dinner was a bowl of lentils and a moral lesson, and your body is actively shutting down. After the service, monks would either return to bed for their second sleep, or, in stricter orders, move straight into study or manual labour. Because nothing says holy discipline like threshing wheat on 4 hours of fragmented rest. Why so early? The idea was to sacrifice comfort and dedicate the first and quietest part of the night to God, uninterrupted by the temptations of daylight, warmth or REM cycles. It was a powerful symbol of devotion. Or at least it was once you got over the numb feet, the candle smoke, and Brother Ambrose's off-key chanting. In the modern world, sleeping alone is often framed as a luxury, a sign of independence, peace, or just an ability to control the blanket. In the medieval world, though, sleeping alone was considered suspicious, impractical, or just downright unsafe. Let's start with the basics. Warmth. Beds, as we've established, weren't exactly toasty. Stone walls and open chimneys didn't do much to trap heat, and central heating was still several plagues away. So people shared beds for body heat, not out of intimacy, but out of basic thermal desperation. Children slept with siblings, parents, and sometimes the neighbour's kid if they were visiting. It was like a sleepover, but nobody asked if you wanted to be there. But beyond warmth, there was a spiritual reason for sleeping in groups. Many people believed the night was when the devil worked overtime. Alone in the dark, your soul might be vulnerable to temptation, or worse, possession. Having others nearby created a kind of moral buffer zone. If something went wrong, at least someone would witness it, or catch the demon first. For children, being alone at night was practically unthinkable. Not just for comfort, but because ghosts, fairies and wandering spirits were all part of the nightly landscape. Tales warned against solitary sleep as a gateway to mischief and spiritual peril. And unlike today's bedtime stories, these tales didn't end in hugs. They ended in disappearances. Even married couples often shared their beds with children, servants, or random guests. Privacy was not a concept so much as a modern myth. In fact, the idea of 2 people sleeping alone in a giant bed was so foreign that it would have been considered either wasteful or deeply, deeply suspicious. In religious contexts, even monks often slept communally, and if someone was assigned to sleep alone, it was often for disciplinary reasons. Yes, in some cases, being alone in bed was literally a punishment. Medieval logic, solitary sleep, grass opportunity for sin. Group sleep, public accountability. Next time you're curled up in your own bed, with your own blanket, in a room that doesn't smell like goat, enjoy the silence. In medieval times, you'd probably have 2 kids, a sheepdog, and a cousin in there with you, all of them snoring. If you've ever accidentally fallen asleep sitting up, in a lecture, a carriage, or a dentist's waiting room, you probably woke up with a crick in your neck and a deep sense of regret. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping upright wasn't an accident. It was a lifestyle. Some medieval folks, particularly the wealthy or religiously devout, chose to sleep propped up rather than lying flat. Why? A few reasons, none of them particularly restful. First, there was a medical belief that lying flat was bad for digestion, the lungs, or the general balance of the bodily humours. In a world where doctors thought a sneeze could rearrange your soul, this logic made perfect sense. Upright sleeping, they believed, helped avoid congestion of the brain, which sounds ominous, but mostly meant don't drown in your own phlegm. Second, there were spiritual concerns. Lying flat was considered too close to the posture of the dead. You didn't want to confuse God, or worse, attract attention from the angel of death by sleeping in the same position used at funerals. Superstitious? Absolutely. But when your local priest doubled as the community's health consultant, you picked your battles carefully. As a result, people often slept partially reclined, supported by large bolsters, pillows, or the wooden headboard equivalent of a medieval lazy-boy. Nobles sometimes had their beds rigged with angled supports to maintain a semi-seated posture, perfect for digesting one's evening meat pie or fending off surprise demon attacks. Monks took it a step further. In stricter orders, they might even sleep sitting upright on a bench or leaning against a cold wall with nothing but a hood to muffle the discomfort. It wasn't about health, it was about discipline. If you were too comfortable, you might dream. If you dreamed, you might sin. If you sinned, well, welcome to confession at 5 a.m. Needless to say, this wasn't about quality rest. It was about virtue, discomfort, and mildly confusing theology. Forget haunted dreams or goblins under the bed. For medieval people, the real monsters of the night were already in the sheets, small, persistent, and entirely uninterested in your prayers. We're talking, of course, about fleas, lice, and the medieval bedroom's unofficial mascot, the bedbug. Let's not sugarcoat it. Hygiene wasn't exactly medieval Europe's strong suit. Baths were rare, laundry was expensive, and soap was sometimes made from substances better left unnamed. Add that to straw-filled mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional live chicken underfoot, and you've got the perfect environment for an all-you-can-eat pest buffet. Fleas and lice were so common they were practically roommates. Peasants dealt with them daily. Nobles, despite their satin sheets and feather beds, were not exempt. In fact, some richer households had dedicated nitpickers, actual servants tasked with removing lice from their employers' hair and clothing. Imagine that as your job title. Master of the Royal Scalp. Bedbugs, meanwhile, were the silent assassins of medieval sleep. They hid in wooden bed frames, mattress seams, and even the cracks in stone walls, emerging at night to feast like tiny vampires. If you ever wondered why medieval people wore nightcaps and slept fully clothed, it wasn't always about warmth. Sometimes it was pest defense armor. Solutions ranged from mildly effective to impressively deranged. Some households burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy to repel bugs. Others slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes in the bed, which may have done little for the pests, but certainly kept romance to a minimum. It wasn't just physical discomfort either. Fleas were often seen as symbols of sin or moral impurity, biting reminders of the fall of man and poor bedding choices. Entire poems were written about fleas, some moralizing, some weirdly romantic, because nothing says I love you like, let us be united like the flea that bites us both. So, while modern sleep is interrupted by buzzing phones and streetlights, medieval sleep was more likely disturbed by scratching, twitching, and the subtle feeling that something was crawling on your shin. Because it was. We've all had restless nights. But have you ever tried falling asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? No? Well, in the Middle Ages some people did exactly that, because apparently nothing says sweet dreams like being prepared to joust in your sleep. Now, to be clear, most people, even knights, didn't regularly sleep in full armour. It was hot, heavy, and loud. Trying to roll over in a suit of chainmail is a bit like trying to nap inside a bag of cutlery. But during wartime or in hostile territory, sleeping partially armoured was considered the safer choice. Comfort? Optional. Survival? Highly recommended. A knight on campaign might remove only his helmet and gauntlets, keeping his mail shirt or breastplate on, just in case enemies decided to stage a midnight surprise party. There's nothing quite like waking up to the sound of hooves and having to suit up while still half dreaming about turnips. In castles under siege, men-at-arms might even sleep with swords or axes at their side, like some very aggressive bedtime security blankets. Shields doubled as pillows, and if the enemy breached the walls, well, at least you wouldn't have to get dressed. Priorities. Of course, sleeping in armour wasn't exactly restorative. Iron isn't breathable, and chainmail has a bad habit of pinching skin. Add cold stone floors, minimal bedding, and the ambient sounds of snoring comrades and crackling torches, and you've got a sleep environment that ranks somewhere below airport terminal on the comfort scale. Even those not in battle sometimes wore light protective gear while sleeping in dangerous regions. Travelling merchants or guards on watch duty might nap in gambesons, thick quilted jackets that offered a bit of protection and slightly more padding than the moral support of prayer alone. And lest we forget, armour wasn't exactly subtle. If you rolled over the wrong way, you might clank so loudly that everyone else woke up and assumed the apocalypse had arrived. Again, in a time when nightly demons, lice infestations, and pigs in your bed weren't considered unusual, you might think that sleepwalking was just one more medieval inconvenience. But oh no, it was much more dramatic than that. In the Middle Ages, if you started wandering around in your sleep, people didn't chalk it up to stress or exhaustion. They assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation if you wanted to impress the local monk, was poorly understood and often feared. The idea that someone could rise from their straw pallet, shuffle across the room, and stare blankly at a wall was less harmless parasomnia and more devil's rehearsal dinner. Accounts from the time suggest that people were genuinely spooked by sleepwalkers. Picture this: a man in a long nightshirt, candle in hand, eyes glazed, mumbling Latin that he didn't actually speak while stepping over livestock. You'd think ghost, or heretic, or both. And depending on your local priest, an exorcism might be scheduled before breakfast. Some believed sleepwalking was caused by bad humours, especially too much black bile, which was the medieval catch-all for anything they couldn't explain. Others thought it happened because the soul was temporarily released during sleep, leaving the body free to bumble around like an unattended mule. To prevent these nightly adventures, people tried everything from herbal remedies to praying over their beds, hanging iron charms, or, in more rural areas, just tying the person's leg to a chair. If that sounds extreme, consider that some medieval homes had open hearths, knives everywhere, and chamber pots just waiting to be tragically overturned. In one curious twist, there were rumours of people climbing onto rooftops in their sleep. Whether or not these accounts were exaggerated, the fear of leaping dreamers led to barred windows and occasional theological debates about whether a person could sin while unconscious. Thankfully, most sleepwalkers just paced, muttered, or attempted to open imaginary doors. But if someone sleepwalked into a church, locals might treat it as a divine sign, or call for a cleansing ritual just to cover all spiritual bases. If medieval life taught people anything, it was how to sleep through chaos. Church bells, thunderstorms, screaming livestock, the occasional siege. For the sleep-deprived denizens of the Middle Ages, these were just ambient noises, the medieval version of white noise. Let's start with the bells. Church bells marked every sacred moment of the day: sunrise, prayer times, meals, and of course the ungodly hour of matins at 2 or 3 a.m. If you lived anywhere near a monastery, your dreams were probably soundtracked by regular tolling. At some point, the brain just accepted it. Bells became the lullaby of an overscheduled soul. And it wasn't just bells. Storms were frequent and terrifying. With no weather apps or triple-glazed windows, you experienced every clap of thunder like the world might end. Roofs leaked, windows rattled, and chimneys howled like banshees. Still, people slept. They had to. Work didn't stop for insomnia. Neither did ploughing, praying, or running from Vikings. Speaking of which, invasions and apocalyptic events weren't always a deal-breaker for bedtime either. In the 14th century, people continued to sleep, somehow, through famine, war, and even the Black Death. When death carts rolled by in the morning, it was considered more of a grim wake-up call than a cause for panic. And if you didn't wake up, well, some believed that was a mercy. There are even records of people sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, and angry mobs. Sleep deprivation was common, and bodies adjusted. If you worked from sunup to sundown, ate barely enough to survive, and spent your day dodging mud, taxes, and spiritual damnation, you were going to fall asleep, hard. And then there were those who used sleep as a kind of escape hatch. Faced with illness, grief, or fear of the world literally ending, which was forecast roughly every century, some people just curled up under a cloak, mumbled a prayer, and took a nap. There's a strange kind of wisdom in that. In the winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts, was cloaked in more than just snow. It was cloaked in tension, suspicion, and a quiet kind of fear that seeped into the timber-framed homes and frozen fields. The people of Salem were Puritans, strict, devout, and deeply superstitious. They believed they were building a holy community in the wilderness, a city on a hill watched by God and stalked by Satan. Life was already hard. The village had recently split from Salem town over politics and religion. Crops had failed. Smallpox had ravaged nearby communities. Wars with native tribes had left many traumatized. There was friction between neighbors, inheritance disputes, and a deep resentment toward outsiders or anyone who didn't quite fit in. Add to this the long, dark, bitter New England winter, and something was bound to break. That break came in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's minister. His 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began to behave strangely. They screamed uncontrollably. They threw things. They contorted their bodies in unnatural ways. At times, they fell silent for hours, eyes wide with terror. Neighbors whispered that they were cursed. The girls claimed they were being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Reverend Parris, unsure of what to do, called in a local doctor, William Griggs. After failing to find any physical cause, Griggs delivered the diagnosis that would plunge the village into chaos. Witchcraft. That single word set fire to the fears already simmering in Salem. In a place where witches were believed to be real, dangerous servants of the devil, the idea was not far-fetched. And now, if the devil could worm his way into the minister's own household, what did that mean for the rest of the community? The girls, prodded by both adults and peers, began naming names. First, they accused women on the margins, social misfits and outcasts. But soon the accusations would reach the respectable, the wealthy, even the pious. Salem was a small village, but what was about to happen would echo far beyond its borders. What began as whispers in the dark would soon become cries from the gallows, and a legacy of paranoia that still haunts America's history books. Once the idea of witchcraft took root in Salem, it spread like ivy, quiet at first, then strangling everything it touched. The afflicted girls, Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, seemed to grow bolder with each passing day. They convulsed in court, screamed during prayers, and claimed they could see dark spirits hovering over certain villages. It wasn't just childhood imagination, it was theatrical, public, and, most disturbingly, believed. The first to be accused were those with the least protection, women who already lived on the edges of society. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, was known for muttering to herself when turned away from doorsteps. People claimed her mumbling was a curse. She smoked a pipe. She snapped at children. She fit the mould of a witch because she didn't fit the mould of a Puritan woman. Sarah Osborne hadn't attended church in over a year and had scandalised the community by marrying her indentured servant after her first husband died. A woman who defied convention, clearly suspect. Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's household, was the most exotic of all. Originating from Barbados, Her storytelling, accent, and folklore frightened the villagers. Under pressure, possibly even physical beatings, Tituba confessed to witchcraft. But instead of clearing the air, her confession blew it wide open. She told a story of a tall man in black, a figure associated with the devil, who asked her to sign a book. She said she saw strange animals, yellow birds, red cats, and even spectral dogs. But most damning of all, she claimed there were other witches in Salem. That was all the court needed to hear. Once Tituba opened the door, others rushed through it. New names were added weekly. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Old grudges were disguised as righteous accusations. Property disputes turned into spectral assaults. If someone's cow died suddenly, it must have been witchcraft. If a baby cried during a prayer, surely that was the devil's doing. The fear became so infectious that not even the innocent dared to speak out. To defend an accused witch was to invite suspicion upon yourself. Silence was safety. And so, the web of accusations widened, trapping the village in its sticky, unseen threads. Logic was fading. Hysteria was now in control. As accusations mounted and the village reached a fever pitch, the colonial government stepped in. Governor William Phipps, recently appointed and eager to maintain order, established a special court to deal with the chaos. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, from the French meaning to hear and determine. But what it really became was a factory for fear-driven justice. The court convened in Salem town in June of 1692, and it was no ordinary tribunal. Its rules were warped by panic. Instead of requiring hard evidence or reliable witnesses, it allowed something far more dangerous: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was testimony that a spirit or spectre of the accused had afflicted the victim. In other words, if a person claimed to have seen your ghost-like form in a dream choking them, that was admissible in court. Never mind that the accused could be asleep at church or miles away. It was their spirit doing the devil's work. You couldn't cross-examine a dream. And worse, you couldn't disprove it. Children were now treated as star witnesses. Their seizures, screams, and gasps in court became more theatrical by the day. One girl, Mary Walcott, would fall into fits the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If a prisoner looked at her, she shrieked. If they didn't look at her, she shrieked louder. The performances were mesmerizing, and the judges, including the influential Judge Samuel Sewall and Chief Justice William Stoughton, accepted it all. Defense lawyers? There were none. The concept didn't exist in colonial trials. If you were accused, you stood alone. If you denied the charges, the afflicted girls writhed in agony. If you confessed, you might be spared death, but only if you named others. The system rewarded lies and punished silence. Worse still, the trials became public spectacles. People travelled from nearby towns to witness them. The accused were paraded into court in shackles, often bewildered, often poor, and almost always powerless. And yet, not everyone believed. Some townsfolk whispered that the girls were faking. Others questioned why only certain types of people were being accused. But few spoke openly. Questioning the court meant questioning the will of God. In Salem, reason had stepped aside, and the law had become a mirror, reflecting fear, not justice. On June 10, 1692, the gallows in Salem claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She was not new to scandal. Her reputation made her an easy target. She wore bright red clothing, ran a tavern, and had been accused of witchcraft years earlier. During her trial, neighbours testified that her spirit pinched them in the night, that their babies died after she passed by, and that she kept enchanted dolls. She denied everything. Still, the court found her guilty. She was led to Gallows Hill, a barren, wind-swept patch of earth just outside Salem. No prayer, no mercy. The rope was pulled, the crowd watched, and with that single execution, the machinery of death began to churn. The hangings that followed came quickly. On July 19th, 5 more women were executed. Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some had good standing in the church. Rebecca Nurse, in particular, was a shocking case, an elderly, pious woman beloved in the community. Even the jury initially found her not guilty. But under pressure from the court and the afflicted girls, the verdict was reversed. Nurse's final words were whispered through the air like a warning. "I am as innocent as the child unborn." But it didn't matter. The noose did not discriminate. In August, more executions followed. On September 22nd, the deadliest day, 8 people were hanged in a single morning. Among them was Martha Corey, a woman who had doubted the trials early on, and her husband Giles Corey, who met a different fate. Giles refused to enter a plea. The court, unable to proceed with a trial without one, resorted to an ancient English punishment, peine forte et dure. He was pressed to death. Stones were piled on his chest, slowly, cruelly, over 3 days. His final words, as legend has it, were "more weight." By the end of the hysteria, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, and at least 5 more died in jail awaiting trial. Dozens confessed falsely to save their lives. Over 200 people were accused. The gallows cast long shadows over Salem, not just on the hill, but in every heart. Fear had become law, and justice, blindfolded, had been led to the scaffold. While the executions claimed the spotlight, hundreds of others sat in cramped, foul-smelling jails, waiting for a verdict or a miracle. Salem's small jail couldn't contain them all. Accused witches were held in neighbouring towns like Ipswich and Boston, chained to walls, starving, freezing, and forgotten. Most of the accused weren't witches, or even outcasts. They were neighbours, friends, parents, children, people whose only crime was having a quarrel with the wrong person or owning land someone else wanted. In many cases, personal grudges disguised as divine justice drove the accusations. A pig wandered into a neighbour's yard and died. Must be witchcraft. Someone refused to help with firewood. Clearly they'd cursed the axe. Mary Easty, sister of the executed Rebecca Nurse, was one such case. She was a respected mother of 7, known for her piety. Initially released by the court, she was rearrested days later after new fits from the afflicted girls. Her second arrest sealed her fate. In a final petition to the judges, Mary begged them not for her own life, but that they put a stop to these proceedings before more innocent blood is shed. She was hanged soon after. Another notable case was Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. After her mother's arrest, Dorothy was interrogated and, under pressure, confessed to being a witch. Her answers, gibberish and fear, were taken as truth. She was imprisoned for 8 months in chains. When finally released, she was mentally broken, never recovering from the trauma. Pregnant women were not spared. Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband John Proctor would later hang, was found guilty and sentenced to die. But because she was pregnant, her execution was delayed. It likely saved her life. She gave birth in jail and was eventually released after the trials ended. Accusations snowballed. Some accused confessed in desperation to avoid death, then named others to shift suspicion away from themselves. Entire families were pulled into the spiral. Fathers, wives, daughters, no one was beyond reach. Meanwhile, the jails swelled beyond capacity. Food was scarce, disease spread. Some died awaiting trial, lost in the legal limbo of paranoia. And still, new names were added each week. In Salem, it no longer mattered who you were, only who was willing to say your name. By the fall of 1692, the spell of hysteria began to crack, not because the court came to its senses, but because reality forced its way back in. The turning point came when accusations grew too bold. People who had once supported the trials found themselves suddenly on the wrong side of them. Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, was arrested and charged with being the ringleader of the witches. He was well-educated, well-spoken, and had previously clashed with influential families in the village. That was enough. But on the day of his execution, Burroughs did something shocking. He stood on the gallows and flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer, something witches were believed incapable of doing. The crowd fell silent. Some wept. Even hardened observers were shaken. But the execution went on. That moment planted a seed of doubt. Then came the accusation of Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps. Suddenly, the hysteria had reached the top of the colony's social ladder. Phipps, already unnerved by growing criticism and chaos, finally took action. In October 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, halting all pending executions and trials. Public sentiment had shifted. Ministers, once silent or complicit, began to speak out. Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected theologians, denounced the use of spectral evidence. "It were better," he said, "that 10 suspected witches should escape, than one innocent person should be condemned." A radical thought in a society that had, for months, believed exactly the opposite. People who had once cheered the trials began to question them. The jails were still full, but the appetite for more blood had dulled. Too many respected figures were being accused. Too many innocent people had been buried. The villagers had begun to see that this wasn't divine justice. It was madness. Confessions dried up. Some accusers backtracked. Others disappeared from public view. And those who had previously shouted the loudest now lowered their eyes. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had exhausted itself. The public wanted stability. The officials wanted to save face. And Salem, bruised and ashamed, was finally ready to wake from its nightmare. The storm was breaking. But the damage, it had already been done. By late 1692, the judicial system that had fueled the hysteria began to collapse under the weight of its own absurdity. With the court of Oyer and Terminer disbanded in October, a new, more cautious court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was formed in early 1693. This time, things were different. Spectral evidence was no longer allowed, and the judges were noticeably more skeptical of the accuser's wild claims. The result? The convictions slowed dramatically. Many accused witches were acquitted outright. Of the 56 cases brought before the new court, the majority were released. Even those who had already confessed began to recant their testimonies, admitting that fear, torture, or pressure had forced them to lie. The dramatic performances of the afflicted girls lost their persuasive power. The most prominent case in the unravelling of the trials was that of Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected minister who came under suspicion. While he was never formally charged, the fact that such a high-ranking devout man could be suspected highlighted how arbitrary and corrupt the process had become. The court, once ferocious, was now cautious. They began quietly releasing those still in jail. First, those with little evidence against them, and eventually even those who had confessed to witchcraft under duress. Meanwhile, families of the executed began to demand justice. John Proctor's children petitioned for the return of his property. Rebecca Nurse's family launched a campaign to clear her name. In time, community shame replaced community fear. Church congregations fractured. Friendships were severed. The very fabric of Salem's social order had been shredded. Governor Phipps, realizing the colony's growing international embarrassment, pardoned the remaining prisoners in 1693. But even freedom came at a cost. Many families had to pay for their own jail fees before being released. Imagine losing your home, your health, and nearly your life, only to be handed a bill for the privilege of surviving. By the end of the ordeal, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, 5 died in jail, and over 200 had been accused. The court didn't just collapse, it imploded, leaving behind a crater of guilt, grief, and disbelief. The trials had ended, but the healing had not even begun. Salem was a village forever altered by the people it had lost, the justice it had abandoned, and the mirror it was now forced to look into. The gallows were silent. The jails had emptied. But Salem was far from peaceful. The town wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by guilt. What had started with a handful of sick girls had exploded into a communal act of destruction. Families had been torn apart, reputations ruined, and innocent lives ended. And now, the survivors had to live in the wreckage. Neighbours could no longer look each other in the eye. The same people who once prayed together had testified against one another. Some of the afflicted girls quietly left town. Others faded from the public eye. A few, like Anne Putnam Jr., would later express remorse. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and publicly apologised for her role in the trials, blaming delusion by Satan. But for many, the damage was beyond words. The court officials, too, carried their burden. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent figures in the trials, was one of the few to admit wrongdoing. In a remarkable act of public penance, he stood during a church service in 1697 while a minister read out his confession and prayer for forgiveness. It was a rare moment of accountability in a time when most tried to forget. But forgetting wasn't easy. The families of the condemned began demanding compensation. Over the years, petitions flooded the Massachusetts government, asking for official pardons, for returned property, for public acknowledgement that the executed were innocent. Slowly the government responded. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of some of the victims, and offered limited financial restitution to their heirs. But even that wasn't comprehensive. Some families, like the Coreys and the Proctors, were left out entirely. Whispers of witchcraft never quite left New England. But in Salem, the shame became part of the town's identity. The village eventually changed its name to Danvers, perhaps to distance itself from its infamous past. Gallows Hill was never officially marked, as if the town hoped to bury not just the dead, but the memory of what had happened. But the memory persisted, in sermons, in stories, in the silence between former friends. Salem had not been cursed by witches. It had been cursed by fear, by pride, and by unchecked power. And that curse would linger long after the executions stopped. The Salem witch trials ended more than 3 centuries ago, but their legacy continues to echo, not just in textbooks and historical tours, but in how we understand justice, fear, and the fragility of truth. What happened in 1692 wasn't simply a strange episode of mass hysteria. It was a breakdown of logic, compassion, and legal integrity in the face of panic. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers, became executioners, simply by believing too easily and questioning too little. The courts, meant to protect the innocent, became tools of oppression. Religion was weaponized. Testimony became theatre, and silence became guilt. One of the most chilling aspects of Salem's tragedy is how quickly it unfolded. In a matter of months, fear overcame fact. Old grudges disguised as spiritual warfare became death sentences. It didn't take demons or devils, it only took belief in them. But the trials also taught hard-earned lessons that would ripple through American society. In the years and centuries that followed, the Salem episode would be cited repeatedly in debates about due process and civil liberties. The US Constitution, written nearly a century later, would explicitly prohibit things like ex post facto laws and bills of attainder, measures that had, in effect, doomed the accused in Salem. The guarantee of a right to legal counsel, the right to face your accusers, and the requirement for concrete evidence were hard-won principles forged, in part, from the ashes of Gallows Hill. In modern times, the phrase witch hunt has become shorthand for political persecution or moral panic, though it's often used with little regard for the real terror those words represent. In truth, Salem was not a metaphor. It was a town where people were hanged for imaginary crimes, betrayed by the very systems designed to protect them. Perhaps the most lasting lesson is this: fear unchecked can become its own form of tyranny. And when fear is legitimized by power, by courts, by churches, by governments, it becomes almost unstoppable. The Salem witch trials are a cautionary tale, not just of one village's descent into madness, but of how easily reason can fall when fear is given authority. The gallows may be gone, the courtroom's quiet, but the warning still stands. Truth is fragile, justice is not automatic, and history has a habit of repeating itself, unless we remember. Fulvia was born around 83 BCE into the elite yet slightly eccentric Fulvi family, an old plebeian house that had long since clawed its way into the upper echelons of Roman politics. Though not one of the oldest patrician clans, the Fulvi had produced consuls, generals, and orators. Their bloodline carried both ambition and a taste for disruption. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was known more for his bumbling speech than his political legacy. His nickname, Bambalio, literally referred to his stammer. But Fulvia, she was no stammerer. She was born to command. From a young age, Fulvia would have been surrounded by the sharp-edged world of Roman power. Senators and generals debated policy in her home. Elections and treachery were daily news. She would have seen how politics wasn't just played in the forum, but in marriages, funerals, rumours, and backroom deals. Women in elite Roman households were expected to be quiet partners, refined, educated, and obedient. Fulvia would break all of those expectations. She was wealthy, highly educated, and connected, and she knew it. While her early life remains hazy in the historical record, her later actions suggest a young woman who was observant, politically literate, and utterly unafraid. This wasn't someone who faded into the background. She had a strong personality, a sharp political mind, and a will to act even in the male-dominated space of Roman governance. This was also a period of unprecedented instability. The Republic was unravelling. Civil wars, populist revolts, and power struggles between generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar were turning Rome into a pressure cooker. The old rules were collapsing, and Fulvia came of age right in the middle of it. Rather than recoil from chaos, Fulvia would learn to use it. Her early life didn't produce the kind of modest matron Rome idealized. It produced a woman who saw politics not as a man's world to be feared, but as a battlefield to be mastered. She would go on to marry 3 powerful men, each one a radical player in Roman history. But Fulvia wouldn't just marry power. She would command armies, lead revolts, and become the first Roman woman to appear on coinage, not as a goddess, but as herself. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia, but she was ready for Rome. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and it was anything but conventional. Clodius was no ordinary Roman noble. He was a populist agitator, a political arsonist with a flair for chaos, scandal, and street-level power. To many of the Roman elite, he was dangerous. To the masses, he was a hero. And to Fulvia, he was a strategic opportunity. Their marriage, sometime in the early 50s BCE, united Fulvia with the man who had turned the Roman Republic into his personal stage. Clodius was infamous for his theatrical defiance of tradition. He had once disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a sacred female-only religious ceremony in Caesar's home, scandalous behaviour that only seemed to raise his popularity. He later renounced his patrician status to run for the tribunate of the plebs, an office that gave him veto power over the Senate. Clodius understood Rome's street politics better than most, and Fulvia, far from being a passive consort, was right there beside him. She wasn't a silent partner. Roman sources suggest that Fulvia actively participated in her husband's political world. She engaged with his supporters, was visible during his campaigns, and managed their household as a hub for Clodian politics. Together, they represented a new kind of Roman power couple. Bold, populist, and unapologetically aggressive. But the alliance came at a cost. In 52 BCE, Clodius was murdered on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his political rival, Titus Annius Milo. His death sent shockwaves through Rome. But Fulvia was not about to mourn quietly. She staged a political funeral that historians still talk about today. She paraded Clodius's mutilated body through the Roman Forum, bloodied wounds exposed for maximum effect. The public was horrified and enraged. Riots erupted. The Senate House was burned to the ground. Fulvia had turned personal grief into public uprising. This was her first major political act, and it worked. Her ability to manipulate public emotion, use spectacle as strategy, and wield her husband's legacy as a weapon made her a new kind of player in Roman politics. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia had stepped out of the shadow, and Rome would never see her the same way again. Fulvia didn't linger in mourning. In Rome, political capital had a short shelf life, and she understood that better than anyone. Shortly after the violent death of Clodius Pulcher, she entered into a second marriage, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and one of Julius Caesar's most passionate supporters. On the surface, Curio seemed an unlikely match. He had a flamboyant reputation and a taste for drama, but beneath the bravado was a sharp political operator. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, Curio wielded enormous influence during one of Rome's most volatile periods. The Republic teetered between war and peace, between Caesar's ambitions and the Senate's resistance. Fulvia saw in Curio not just a husband, but a bridge to the next power block. This was no romantic rebound. It was a calculated alliance. With Clodius gone, Fulvia needed a new political anchor, someone who could carry forward the populist legacy her first husband had built, and someone who had Caesar's backing. Curio fit both bills. Through him, Fulvia remained tightly embedded in the shifting power dynamics of Rome. She didn't just marry into the movement, she helped shape it. Fulvia ensured Clodius's supporters stayed active, rebranding their cause under Curio's leadership and keeping the urban masses politically engaged. But the Roman world was collapsing fast. Tensions between Caesar and Pompey exploded into civil war. Curio threw himself into the fight, taking Caesar's side. Fulvia, as always, remained politically involved. She reportedly helped organize support and manage resources for her husband's campaign. In 49 BCE, Curio led a military expedition to Africa to secure Caesar's position, but it was a disaster. He was ambushed and killed by the forces of King Juba the Aenes of Numidia. His death was brutal, and his army annihilated. Once again, Fulvia was widowed, and once again, Rome waited to see if she would fade into the background. She didn't. Curio's death only solidified her status as a political widow with dangerous resilience. She had now lost 2 husbands to Rome's civil unrest, and both had died fighting for populist causes. But Fulvia was far from finished. Her most audacious partnership, and her most dramatic chapter, was still to come. Fulvia's third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and loyal ally of Julius Caesar. Their union, forged sometime around 47 BCE, wasn't merely a romantic attachment, it was a merger of power. Fulvia had already proven herself as a master of Roman street politics. Antony, rising rapidly through the military and political ranks, needed that kind of savvy support in Rome. Together, they formed one of the most politically potent couples of the late Republic. By the time of their marriage, Fulvia was no stranger to blood and betrayal. She had buried 2 husbands and outmaneuvered countless enemies. Antony was no stranger to scandal either. He drank, he gambled, and his personal life was notoriously chaotic. But with Fulvia, he had found someone who could do more than entertain him. She could defend his interests, hold his alliances together, and rally supporters when he was away on campaign. And Antony, despite his brash exterior, understood her value. He allowed Fulvia to exercise authority that no Roman woman had publicly wielded before. She opened his correspondence. She issued orders in his absence. She sat in on meetings and influenced appointments. Roman sources, mostly hostile, depicted her as overbearing and power-hungry. But what disturbed them most wasn't her ambition. It was that she acted like a Roman man in a world that had no language for such a woman. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic was plunged into chaos once more. Antony rushed to secure his position as Caesar's political heir, but it was Fulvia who held Rome itself. While Antony formed the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia acted as his representative in the capital, managing patronage networks, coordinating with street gangs, and ensuring Antony's supporters remained mobilized. She even helped arrange Antony's official reconciliation with Octavian by marrying her daughter, Clodia, to him, an alliance that would later implode. In public, Fulvia appeared not just as Antony's wife, but as his proxy. Roman coins were minted, bearing both Antony's image and her name, an unprecedented acknowledgement of her status. She wasn't hidden in the shadows of power. She stood in its full glare. But power in Rome was always borrowed, and Fulvia was about to test the limits of how far a woman could go before Rome snapped back. While Mark Antony pursued military campaigns and political deals across the Roman world, it was Fulvia who controlled the streets of Rome. She wasn't just his wife, she was his regent in all but name. In a period where violence, bribery, and raw influence kept order, Fulvia proved she could play the game as well as, if not better than, any man in the Senate. Rome, in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination, was a battlefield without swords. Power had become a moving target. Fulvia understood this, and she anchored Antony's authority in the capital by becoming his political substitute. She directed allies, dealt with the urban plebs, negotiated with factions, and, most daringly, waged war with words and silver. She financed loyal troops, offered bribes to keep public order, and ensured that any legislation passed favoured Antony's future. Some ancient sources, especially hostile ones like Appian and Dio Cassius, paint Fulvia as manipulative, shrewish, and even warmongering. But beneath the misogynistic exaggeration lies a woman actively doing politics, in a world that had no protocol for a woman doing anything beyond weaving and mourning. Fulvia was building coalitions, backing military commanders, and even issuing decrees, functions normally reserved for senators and consuls. She also made public appearances and maintained strong relationships with veteran soldiers, a politically vital demographic in the power struggles of the late Republic. While Antony was campaigning in the east, Fulvia was often the face of his authority in Italy, meeting with centurions, influencing decisions about land distribution, and reminding the soldiers that their loyalty to Antony came with rewards. But this accumulation of power came at a cost. Roman aristocrats, particularly the faction aligned with Octavian, Caesar's heir and Antony's increasingly bitter rival, resented Fulvia's influence. They viewed her as a meddling woman with too much sway over legions, laws, and loyalties. Her ability to act without male guardianship was not just threatening, it was unprecedented. Fulvia wasn't naive. She knew the tension between Antony and Octavian was growing. She could see that their alliance was cracking. And she understood something that neither man seemed to fully grasp yet. The Republic wasn't big enough for both of them. So Fulvia began preparing for the next phase. Not diplomacy, but confrontation. She had stood behind power long enough. Now, she was ready to take it into her own hands. In 41 BCE, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war against Octavian, the future Augustus, and she didn't do it quietly. With her husband Mark Antony still stationed in the east, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother and a consul, took it upon themselves to challenge Octavian's authority in Italy. The cause? Ostensibly, it was to defend Antony's interests and protect the land rights of Roman veterans loyal to him. But underneath it all, Fulvia's fingerprints were everywhere. This was not just politics. This was a military rebellion led by a Roman woman, the first and only time in Roman history that a woman would actively provoke and organize a civil war. The conflict, known as the Perusine War, was triggered by Octavian's controversial land redistribution program, which displaced many Italians to reward his soldiers. Fulvia seized on the growing discontent, portraying Octavian as a tyrant and traitor to Caesar's legacy. With Lucius acting as her frontman in the Senate and Fulvia organizing behind the scenes, They raised 8 legions and seized the city of Perugia, modern-day Perugia. Make no mistake, this was Fulvia's war. Ancient sources suggest she was more invested in the conflict than Lucius himself. She rallied troops, stirred the public, and even corresponded with generals. Rome buzzed with rumours of her commanding legions, issuing orders, and forcing Lucius into confrontations he didn't want. Octavian, though surprised, acted quickly. He besieged Perugia through the winter of 41–40 BCE, cutting off supplies and hammering the city into submission. Fulvia, stuck between dwindling food and political betrayal, watched her bold gamble unravel. By early 40,000 BCE, the city surrendered. Lucius Antonius was spared, likely as a gesture to avoid alienating Antony. But Fulvia was exiled. The woman who had once commanded riots, marriages, armies, and public opinion was now deemed too dangerous for Roman soil. She was sent to Sicyon in Greece, where she hoped to reunite with Antony. But Antony didn't come running. The once powerful alliance between husband and wife had eroded in the fog of war and distance. Fulvia had acted in his name, but perhaps without his blessing. She had dared to do what no Roman woman had before, wage a civil war. And now the Republic had made her pay the price. Banished from Rome, Fulvia landed in Sicyon, a city in Greece that had become a kind of diplomatic purgatory for failed power players. She had gone to war, not for personal gain, but in her husband's name. She believed she was defending Mark Antony's interests, his honour, and perhaps their shared vision of Rome. But what awaited her in exile wasn't a hero's welcome. It was silence. Fulvia had risked everything, her status, her alliances, her life. And yet Antony did not immediately rush to meet her. In fact, by the time Fulvia arrived in Greece, Antony was already entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their romantic relationship had begun or was merely brewing, the symbolism was crushing. While Fulvia was raising legions, Antony was raising goblets at banquets beside a queen. The betrayal cut deep, not just personally, but politically. Fulvia had fought a war to protect Antony's power in Italy, and in response, he let her hang out to dry. Some ancient historians, especially Plutarch, suggest that Antony was furious with her for launching the Perisine War without his direct approval. Others argue he welcomed her downfall. It cleared the way for a marriage alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia would have never tolerated. Still, Fulvia wasn't entirely without supporters. Some of Antony's troops, fiercely loyal to her, urged reconciliation. But her health had begun to fail. After enduring siege, exile, and betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BCE, possibly from illness, stress, or heartbreak, or all three. She was around 43 years old. Her death provided Antony with a clean political exit. He met with Octavian shortly afterward and agreed to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia, as part of a renewed peace treaty. The triumvirs were temporarily united again, but only because Fulvia, the one woman bold enough to challenge their designs, was gone. Fulvia's legacy would soon be overshadowed by Cleopatra, whose myth eclipsed nearly every Roman woman of the period. But make no mistake, Fulvia was the prototype. She didn't wield power from behind a curtain. She marched into it, stood at the centre, and dared to command armies in a world that treated women as furniture. Rome didn't know what to do with her, so it erased her. But the ashes of her rebellion would linger, and her story was far from ordinary. After Fulvia's death in 40 BCE, the men she had once manoeuvred, Antony, Octavian, and even her former allies, began the quiet work of rewriting her legacy. She couldn't defend herself, so the narrative was shaped by her enemies and the uneasy survivors of her ambition. And like so many powerful women in history, Fulvia became a scapegoat. Ancient sources, mostly penned by men with vested interests, painted her as the reason for the Perisine War, the rift between Antony and Octavian, and even the general disorder of the Republic. Appian, Dio Cassius, and Plutarch depict her as overbearing, jealous, and driven by a lust for power. They blamed her for dragging Lucius Antonius into conflict, for antagonizing Octavian, and even for Antony's eventual estrangement from Rome. But were these accusations fair? Hardly. Fulvia had operated within a political climate where violence and manipulation were expected, at least if you were a man. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, and far less ruthless than Octavian would eventually prove to be. Her only true deviation was that she was a woman acting like a Roman man, and Rome didn't know how to digest that. She wasn't cloistered in the home, weaving quietly or serving as a political ornament. She was writing letters to generals, organizing street mobs and commanding loyalty from troops. And that made her dangerous, not just to Octavian, but to history itself. Even Mark Antony, the man whose legacy she had fought to preserve, conveniently blamed Fulvia for the civil strife. After reconciling with Octavian and marrying his sister, Antony used Fulvia's death as a diplomatic cleansing. Her memory became the price of his political survival. There were no monuments raised in her honour, no grand funeral, no mourning speeches in the Senate. Just silence. Yet her enemies couldn't erase her entirely. Fulvia had done too much. She had raised armies, steered elections, negotiated alliances, and fought a civil war. She was the first Roman woman whose name appeared on coinage, not as a deity or metaphor, but as a political agent. The damage to her reputation was deliberate, but so was her presence in the historical record. Despite every attempt to bury her behind caricature and slander, Fulvia refused to vanish. Her defiance still echoes. You just have to listen past the men. Fulvia's story ends in silence, but her legacy is anything but quiet. In the centuries that followed her death, historians and writers struggled to place her in Rome's grand narrative, because Fulvia broke every rule of what a Roman woman was supposed to be. She didn't just advise power from the shadows, she became power, and that made her both unforgettable and deeply unsettling to a patriarchal world. In a society where women were expected to influence through whisper and marriage, Fulvia shouted through policy, war, and political theatre. She was not a consort, she was a commander. And yet, she was remembered more for her defiance than her accomplishments. Roman historians couldn't handle a woman who didn't stay in her place, so they rewrote her as shrill, power-hungry, and disruptive. But read between the lines, and a different figure emerges. Fulvia was the first Roman woman to mint coins with her name. She organised political factions, leveraged marriage as a tactical weapon, and manipulated Roman street politics with stunning effectiveness. She moved through the civil wars of the 1st century BCE, not as a bystander, but as a player. A woman whose influence terrified senators and shaped the fate of triumvirs. Her downfall wasn't due to incompetence, it was due to timing and gender. Had she been born a man, she might have been remembered as a second Caesar or a more charming Cato. Instead, she was cast as the wicked woman who dared too much. Still, her legacy quietly lingered. Later, Roman women like Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra herself, though of a different world, would all operate in the shadow Fulvia helped carve. They would manipulate emperors, wield armies, and control succession. But Fulvia did it first, and with no imperial title to shield her. Today, modern historians have begun re-examining Fulvia with fresh eyes. No longer a cautionary tale, she is being recognised as one of the most politically active women in Roman history, someone who tested the boundaries of female power and paid the price. She didn't simply live in the age of triumvirs, she challenged them. And while Rome may have tried to erase her, Fulvia left fingerprints in every corner of its collapse. Not a footnote, a force, a woman centuries ahead of her time. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a country teetering between two worlds, one rooted in centuries-old systems of oppression, and another aching to breathe free. In the Deep South, segregation wasn't just a social norm, it was the law. Black Americans were barred from restaurants, schools, buses, voting booths, and even drinking fountains. Police brutality was rampant. Lynching still occurred. And in places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters were being met with snarling dogs and high-pressure fire hoses. But change was coming, and it wasn't asking for permission. In just a few years, the civil rights movement had surged into the national spotlight. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts had become familiar headlines. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis were no longer just names. They were symbols of defiance. The March on Washington wasn't born out of a single conversation. It was the result of rising frustration and fierce hope. Black Americans were no longer content with waiting. They were demanding civil rights, and they were determined to make their voices heard where it mattered most, the nation's capital. The idea of a mass march in Washington, D.C. had been floating around for decades. A. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer and longtime civil rights advocate, had originally proposed the concept in the 1940s. Back then, it was meant to pressure the Roosevelt administration to desegregate the defense industry. That protest was called off after Roosevelt caved and signed an executive order. But now, in 1963, the stakes were even higher. Randolph, along with other civil rights leaders, including Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision. And this time, they weren't just marching for jobs. They were marching for dignity, for voting rights, for school desegregation, for equal pay, and most importantly, for the basic human right to live free of fear. Over a dozen major civil rights organizations came together to plan it, despite their many disagreements, because they understood the power of a unified front. The countdown had begun. Buses were being organized, flyers were spreading. Word of mouth was moving faster than newspapers. And across the country, Black Americans were preparing for what would become one of the most unforgettable moments in American history. The dream was taking shape, one footstep at a time. Pulling off a protest of any kind in Washington, D.C. was no small feat, but planning one for over 100,000 people, possibly more, was madness. Logistically, it sounded like a nightmare. Food, water, transportation, sound systems, bathrooms, medical teams, permits, crowd control, safety plans, and yet, somehow, they made it happen. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Bayard Rustin, a man who, despite being openly gay and often kept behind the scenes for political reasons, was a master strategist. Rustin had once studied non-violence directly under Mahatma Gandhi's followers in India. He had marched, been jailed, beaten, and surveilled by the FBI. But nothing fazed him. He saw the March on Washington as a chance to show the world what disciplined, non-violent protest could achieve when coordinated with military precision. In just 8 weeks, Rustin and his team transformed the idea into a reality. The march was officially called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and it was deliberately framed to include both racial justice and economic opportunity. That dual message was no accident. While Dr. King would later become the spiritual symbol of the day, it was Randolph and Rustin who made sure the demands were just as much about unemployment, minimum wage, and workers' rights as they were about civil rights. Meanwhile, tensions simmered beneath the surface. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were nervous, deeply nervous. They feared riots, backlash, or worse, bloodshed. Civil rights leaders assured them the protest would be peaceful. Still, the National Guard was on standby, hospitals in D.C. were put on alert, and liquor sales were banned for the day. Federal workers were even told they could stay home. And then there was the question of unity. The Big Six civil rights organizations, NAACP, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, often clashed over tactics. Some wanted more radical action, others more diplomacy. SNCC's young firebrands were growing impatient with King's non-violent approach, but they all agreed on this. The time for silence had passed. Rustin's plan read like a military operation. Every bus and train was tracked. Every speaker was timed to the minute. Every route had marshals trained in crowd control. They weren't just planning a march. They were orchestrating a moment that would shake the conscience of a nation. August 28th, 1963. A sweltering Wednesday in Washington, D.C. The sun was already hot by 9 a.m., and the humidity clung to the skin like a second shirt. But it didn't stop them. From every corner of the country, they came. Black, white, young, old, students, clergy, factory workers, and celebrities. Some wore their Sunday best. Others clutched protest signs. They came by bus, train, carpool, and even foot. Over 250,000 people in total, converging on the National Mall like a rising tide of hope. And yet, there was no chaos. Despite the government's fear of riots and unrest, the scene was astonishingly calm. Volunteers directed foot traffic. The Red Cross handed out water. Groups sang freedom songs, held hands, and cheered as new marchers arrived. You could hear gospel choirs near the reflecting pool and chants of jobs and freedom echoing off the marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities joined in too. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. But no one was there for autographs. They were there to witness history and lend their voices to a cause bigger than any one person. The crowd was orderly but energized. There was no pushing, no looting, no violence. Instead, there was a shared understanding that this wasn't just a protest. It was a sacred moment. For many Black Americans, just standing on the mall felt like a quiet act of revolution. To be seen, to be counted, to say, "We are here," in front of the same Lincoln Memorial where the great emancipator sat in stone. It was a full circle moment, generations in the making. At exactly noon, the official program began. Leaders took the stage one by one, each representing different organizations, ideologies and regions, but united in message. Speakers demanded equal pay, desegregated schools, a living wage, and an end to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang. Marian Anderson, who had once been banned from singing at Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang for thousands beneath the open sky. As the hours passed, the tension grew, not from unrest, but from anticipation. The man everyone was waiting for had not yet spoken, and when he did, the world would stop, listen, and remember. The march wasn't just making history, it was becoming legend, minute by minute. By mid-afternoon, the crowd had grown quiet, not because they were tired, but because they knew what was coming. Standing in the shade of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He wore a dark suit, a neatly tied tie, and an expression of deep calm that barely concealed the fire building inside him. He carried prepared remarks, typed and written collaboratively with his advisors the night before. But what the world would remember wasn't what had been typed. It was what came from his heart. He began with measured intensity, outlining the grim realities of segregation, police violence, and broken promises. 100 years later, he said, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro is still not free. His voice rose and fell like a sermon. He used repetition, rhythm, and silence not as fillers, but as instruments. The crowd listened in rapt attention, some nodding, some wiping away tears, others holding signs that simply read, "Now." But it was what happened next that changed the tone of the entire event, and arguably the trajectory of the civil rights movement itself. Standing just behind King was gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier that day. She suddenly cried out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And King did. He set aside his notes, gripped the podium, and launched into a passage he'd delivered before, but never like this. "I have a dream," he said, and the crowd leaned in. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Each phrase rang louder, clearer, more resolute. I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It wasn't a speech anymore. It was a vision, a prayer, a lightning bolt through history. By the time King closed with the words, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd erupted. Applause, tears, shouts of joy. They knew they had just witnessed something more than oratory. They had heard prophecy. The power of the March on Washington wasn't just in the speeches or the music, it was in the people. The sheer scale of humanity gathered that day was overwhelming. They came from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, and everywhere in between. Some were seasoned activists who had marched a dozen times before. Others had never left their hometowns until now. They packed lunches, rode buses for over 20 hours, and slept in their church clothes just to be there. Many were ordinary people, maids, teachers, steelworkers, postal clerks, who saw themselves not as political figures, but as witnesses. They didn't just want change. They were the change. There were also children in the crowd. Young black girls with ribbons in their hair, boys with hand-drawn signs. Parents hoisted toddlers onto their shoulders so they could see the Lincoln Memorial in the distance and hear the speakers' voices carried over loudspeakers. To them, this wasn't just an event. It was the beginning of a new world. Some faces stood out. There was a young John Lewis, just 23 years old, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. His original speech had been so fiery, so uncompromising, that senior leaders asked him to tone it down minutes before he went on stage. He agreed, but just barely. His call for radical change still shook the crowd. And then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman to speak that day. Not on her own behalf, but reading a prepared statement on behalf of other civil rights women. The organizers had faced criticism for sidelining female voices. Bates's brief but powerful message underscored a harsh reality. Even within a movement about equality, some voices still struggled to be heard. Also present were union organizers, rabbis, nuns, priests, and students of every background. They didn't all agree on strategy. Some favored King's nonviolence, others leaned toward Malcolm X's more militant posture. But for that one day, those differences didn't matter. Unity won out. It was a visual symphony of American possibility, white and black hands linked in solidarity, Freedom Now buttons pinned to chests, and the sound of 250,000 souls breathing as one. The faces in the crowd weren't just watching history unfold, they were shaping it, and none of them would ever forget what they saw. While the world saw unity, inspiration, and poetic justice on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, behind the scenes, the March on Washington was anything but simple. What looked like a perfectly synchronized movement was, in truth, held together with string, sweat, and a lot of last-minute compromise. Bayard Rustin, the chief architect of the march, had to battle not just logistics, but politics. He was constantly under scrutiny, not just because he was openly gay and a former communist, but because some civil rights leaders feared his identity would be used to discredit the movement. In fact, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had once threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of being lovers if King didn't remove Rustin from an earlier campaign. That threat haunted every stage of planning. Then there was the issue of women's voices. Despite the critical roles played by women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, none were invited to deliver major speeches on their own. Rosa Parks was in the crowd that day, revered by all, but she was not given the microphone. Behind the powerful optics of the march lay the truth. The movement still struggled with its own hierarchies and blind spots. Even within the Big Six organizations, friction bubbled. SNCC leaders were growing increasingly disillusioned with the slow pace of change and the older generation's insistence on moderation. They wanted to confront systemic racism more aggressively. CORE had similar frustrations, but unity was deemed too important, just for one day. Meanwhile, the federal government watched with clenched teeth. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had assigned over 100 agents to spy on organizers. They bugged hotel rooms, followed key figures, and compiled dossiers. They were convinced the march would turn violent or that communists would hijack the event. When nothing of the sort happened, they simply doubled down on their surveillance, especially of Dr. King. And let's not forget money. The march cost over $250,000, equivalent to millions today. Most of it was raised through unions and sympathetic donors, but organizers scrambled until the final hour. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington was historic, yes, but it was also deeply human. Imperfect, messy, political, and unfinished. Just like the country it sought to heal. The sun began to dip behind the Washington Monument as the crowds slowly dispersed. People hugged, cried, sang, and lingered as long as they could, reluctant to leave what felt like sacred ground. But the march was over. The speeches had been delivered. The signs had been raised high. The world had watched. And now the question hung heavy in the humid August air. What happens next? In the immediate days that followed, the media reaction was cautiously positive. Major newspapers acknowledged the historic nature of the event, though often with a tone of detached curiosity. Some called it orderly and dignified, which was code for no one rioted. Few outlets gave much space to the specific demands of the march, like the call for a federal jobs program or a $2 minimum wage, equivalent to around $20 today. But everyone covered Dr. King's speech. That, at least, could not be ignored. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the idea of the march, watched it unfold on television with growing admiration and, perhaps, surprise. He called the event impressive and met with civil rights leaders at the White House immediately afterward. But legislative movement remained slow. His proposed Civil Rights Act was still stalled in Congress, caught in the claws of Southern opposition. Some activists were disappointed. They had hoped the march would result in immediate action. Instead, it was back to the grind, organizing, marching, resisting, and mourning those who paid the price for justice. Just weeks later, that reality hit hard. On September 15, 1963, 4 black girls were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham. The dream had been voiced, yes, but the nightmare wasn't over. Still, something had changed. The March on Washington marked a new phase in the civil rights movement. It proved that mass protest could be disciplined, powerful, and impossible to ignore. It brought together a coalition broader than ever before. Labor unions, faith leaders, celebrities, students, and working-class Americans, all in one place, united by justice. And most of all, it gave the movement a voice. A dream. A speech that would be quoted, studied, and echoed across the world. The march was over, but the road was just beginning. And that road would soon lead through blood, legislation, and transformation. The March on Washington didn't just rattle the conscience of America, it reshaped its moral landscape. What had begun as an audacious act of protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement's legacy, permanently altering how Americans understood justice, democracy, and the power of collective action. In legislative terms, the march didn't yield immediate victories, but it created momentum. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. It outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination based on race, colour, religion, sex, or national origin. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed, striking at the very heart of Jim Crow laws. Would these bills have passed without the march? Possibly. But would they have had the same moral force, the same undeniable public pressure? Probably not. For Martin Luther King Jr., the The speech that day propelled him into a new realm. He went from respected leader to global icon. But fame came with cost: surveillance, threats, and ultimately assassination in 1968. The dream he spoke of on those steps would become more poignant, more tragic, and more revered with each passing year. For the broader movement, the march showed what unity could achieve. It gave organisers a blueprint for large-scale mobilisation, and it inspired a generation of activists, both in the US and abroad. Anti-apartheid organisers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and future human rights leaders across the globe would cite the March on Washington as a model. But the legacy isn't just historical. The language of the march, the idea of jobs and freedom, the image of peaceful resistance, the echoes of "I have a dream," still pulses through modern protest. From the Million-Man March to Black Lives Matter rallies, echoes of 1963 reverberate with every chant and every cardboard sign. In Washington, D.C., King's Memorial now stands just across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial. Visitors walk past his towering likeness carved in stone, with words from that August day etched into the granite. But the real memorial isn't in stone. It's in classrooms, voting booths, marches, and voices refusing to stay silent. Because the dream wasn't meant to rest in history books. It was meant to be lived. And the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us to do just that. More than 60 years have passed since that summer afternoon when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits. Dr. King's speech is taught in schools. His voice, steady and strong, echoes in national memory like a sacred refrain. But for many, the question remains: has the dream been realized, or has it merely been delayed? In some ways, progress is undeniable. The legal framework of segregation was dismantled. Voting rights, though now under fresh assault in many states, were won through blood, marches, and court battles. The presence of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term US president was unthinkable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once illegal in much of the country, is now protected by federal law. These are not small things. They are victories carved out by relentless struggle. And yet, the original demands of the march, the ones often overshadowed by King's speech, still echo unresolved. The call for a living wage, still unmet. Racial disparities in education, housing, employment and healthcare remain entrenched. Police brutality, the very thing that sparked much of the early civil rights organizing, continues to ignite outrage and protest. The dream of true economic justice, of a country where opportunity is not predetermined by zip code or skin color, is still far from reality. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have taken up the mantle, often using the imagery and rhetoric of the 1963 march as both inspiration and indictment. They march through the same cities, chant on the same streets, and demand the same basic human rights. But they do so in a world transformed by social media, surveillance, and new forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never meant to be the conclusion. It was a flashpoint, a stake in the ground that said, "This is who we are, and this is what we demand." It was a declaration, not a resolution, so the dream remains, battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but still alive. Whether it is deferred, distorted, or one day fulfilled depends not on the past, but on us, on the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the courage we summon to march, again and again, until the dream becomes a shared, lived reality.
Charge! Attack!
Finest catch today, sir. Fresh from the river.
I'll take this lot here. A fair price for a fair trade. You must lead the flock with greater conviction.
I am trying, Master, but the people are afraid.
The harvest has been poor, and the granaries are nearly empty. We must act decisively to ensure the survival of the realm.
The Western Passage is too perilous.
But the potential trade routes outweigh the risks.
We must secure the African corridor first.
Fine fish for a fair price.
Indeed. Wrap them in the herbs for me.
That looks delicious.
3 men bound into the fire. Look, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the flames.
Charge!
Hold the line! Push them back!
Attack now!
If we head south now, we might avoid the main patrol entirely.
He might be right. It is a risk, but staying here is worse.
Agreed. We ride at once.
Look here. The alignment only happens once a generation.
And this symbol, it matches the text in the ancient scrolls.
By this handshake, we seal the pact between our houses.
Agreed. May this alliance bring prosperity to us both.
Let go of the basket!
I will not. We need this bread to survive.
Move aside!
The scouts report a large host approaching from the east, my liege.
We are exposed here. We must move to the high ground.
To the walls! Push forward!
We're breaking through!
A fine vintage and beautiful music. What more could a man ask for?
Freshly baked.
I desire this one.
Very well. 2 pennies, if you please.
No, let me go! This is unjust! Silence! You will come with us! Get him off the food!
firelight grows stronger. It is a cold night.
Yes, but the warmth of this gathering is welcome.
Shall we hear more of the tale?
Pay heed to these words, for they are the foundation of our covenant. We must not stray from this path.
To good fortune and strong ale.
Here, here! Another round!
My compliments to the brewer.